Next, let's talk about the graph editor. The graph editor gives us an alternative way to look at the timeline. Not only does it show us our keys, but it also shows us how the interpolation from key to key actually flows. To access the graph editor, we'll use this button here. When we click on it, you'll notice that the timeline view changes and we now have this graph view. But right now we don't actually see anything on our graph, and that's because we don't have either an object or property selected. But as soon as we select a property, you'll notice that our keys are visible, and not only are they visible, but they're plotted at their respective value. And they're also linked together by these lines, and these lines represent the interpolation between the two keys. If we select one of the keys, you'll notice that this key has linear interpolation, and that linear interpolation is also reflected here on the graph. If we change the interpolation to, say, cubic, you'll see that that's also reflected on the graph, as well as any changes to the curve that we make. Now I'm also going to select this key and change its interpolation. So now we have a nice bouncing interpolation. And what's great about this is when we're on the timeline view, we sort of have to picture it in our heads or use the motion path to figure out how that interpolation is going to affect our object. But when we have the graph editor selected, we can actually see how those interpolation curves flow into one another. Now see, if we play the animation, we've got a relatively decent bouncing animation. There's a few other things that we can do here. One of the things that we can do is change the value of different keys. So if we select, let's say, these two keys here, which is the ball at the highest point, we can click and drag those keys to make the bounce shallower, or we can drag it the opposite way to make the bounce a bit higher. When we let go, the graph view will reset so that we can see all of the keys. So I'm realizing this animation needs some extra keys. And to set keys, we can do that in a few ways. The first way, just like if we were in the timeline, we can drag our object to the position that we want. We can also use the numerical value here, or we can use the inspector value. But in addition to those, we can also mouse over our interpolation curve, and you'll see that the cursor has turned into this pin icon. And that means that we can click to add a point, and then we can click and drag that point to wherever we want. Now, the graph editor also lets us see multiple properties at the same time. Since we only have a single property under this ellipse, let's go ahead and add a couple keys so that we can see the graph view when there's multiple properties. So let's add some X keys. I'm just going to go to the beginning, add a key here, and then add one here so that the ball is sort of bouncing across the artboard, and then we'll finish over here. Now, the reason we can't see that property right now is we just haven't selected it. So we have two ways that we can do that. We can either shift select each one of these properties down here, or we can select the top level object, and that will show us both of the properties at the same time. And we can do this with as many properties as we want. So we could have like rotation keys. So I'll just add a few of those, and we can shift select that to incorporate it. I could also add in some scale keys. So something like this. And then when the ball gets down here, maybe it squashes. And I can select those as well. And you can see how all of that is appearing in your graph view. Now, when you're working with the graph editor, I would recommend focusing on only a couple properties at the same time, because once you start getting a lot of these different properties on the screen, it gets a little bit harder to manipulate things. In the interpolation panel video, I mentioned one other interpolation type, and that's the cubic value. Cubic value gives us handles that we can use on the graph to directly control our interpolation. So instead of changing it over here in the interpolation panel, we can actually control it right here in the graph editor. Now, one thing to keep in mind as you're using the cubic value easing is that the handles on the graph are going to operate differently depending on which keys are set to cubic value. So in this case, the first key is set to cubic value, and the second one is set to linear. So the handles in this case are disconnected, which means we can have this handle going at a different angle from this. They're working independently of one another. But as soon as I convert this next key to a cubic value, at first they start disconnected, but as soon as I start moving it, they become asymmetric, which means that they'll share the same rotation, but we can have different lengths. Now, this is really nice because it allows us to have interpolation that really nicely flows into the next key. So your motion is going to look really nice doing it this way. At the end of the day, it's going to be up to you on when you want to use the graph editor and when you want to just use the timeline view. Typically, if the motion is fairly simple, sort of like this one, most of the time I'm just going to go with the interpolation panel and not even worry about the graph editor. But when things start getting a bit more complicated, like in the case of character animations, things like that, then I'll turn on the graph editor to make sure that all of my interpolation curves are properly flowing from one to the next.